And we are live, that's right, here on Wednesday, May 7th, 2025 in House Transportation. And we have one of our colleagues, Representative Noyes, is here to talk about his piece that he would like considered or amended or adopted. I'm not sure exactly whether we will consider it to be included or if it does come out of the transfer, if we do pass it without it, whether it would be a potential amendment to the bill. The bill's still in progress, S-123. Representative Noyes, why don't you come on up and tell us what you're proposing and what your approach
Right.
may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Apologies for being a little bit late.
Not a problem at all. For the record, Dan Noyes from Wolcott, Vermont. And so we all just came through an election last year where we talked a lot about affordability and the environment. And so I think this amendment kind of looks at both. And the way I did that was to go around affordability is to look at getting our vehicles inspected every other year. And really, the cost of owning a car, you all know, you've probably taken quite a bit of testimony here on vehicle ownership is pretty high. So by going to biannual inspection, we could maybe reduce.
Not renewal.
No,
Not
vehicle
registration,
inspection.
Vehicle
Yep.
inspections.
So every other year, on getting your car inspected instead of the way it is now, every year. 8 other states do it this way. Some require every year around emissions. And then the rest of the state, so particular areas like, for instance, Colorado, like Denver, where have the greater population, you have to have your car inspected every other year to make sure that the vehicle's emission system is working okay. My proposal would be to do it every other year, like Delaware and Missouri, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. So not looking at changing any of the requirements for vehicle inspection. You still have to have your brakes have to work. Your car has to meet the minimum requirement that we have now. It's just doing it every other year instead of every year, having to take that time off of work, having to make an appointment to get your car down there. Just goes to every other year. I also know that the revenue that comes into the state from this vehicle inspection is important to run the DMV or make sure our roads are okay. So the second part of my amendment takes the $8 fee that inspection stations pay to the DMV to $16. So you basically get your car inspected every other year, but the DMV is made whole in terms of the revenue coming in. Just trying to remove that one piece from it. So still keeping with the environmental concerns that we have, still keeping with safety, making sure cars on the road are safe, but just going to every other year is what my amendment looks at. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. It's only 2 things in this. I don't know if everyone's got a copy of it. Pretty basic amendment. So,
Representative Casey.
I like it.
all right.
Representative Burke.
I just would like to maybe hear from the air quality people at ANR. Make sure that they're okay with that.
In case we have regulations that we have.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, just want to make sure we'll be okay with that. But it's interesting being somebody in the past who did a lot of trying to get a car inspected at different inspection stations, pre-tablet, very, the inspection process used to loom very large. And then certainly the OBD issues too. So I understand both sides.
I like the concept and I think, it would save people money. I'm curious from the DMV, the $7 or whatever it is that enough? Is the money we take in for inspections, and you're talking about doubling it, is that the money coming in today, does that pay for the whole program? I mean, you know, they gotta print the books, they gotta, you know, license the people, they gotta manage it all. I'm just sort of curious if that pays initially for it.
Not sure, but we did increase DMV fees by 20% last year.
And yet we don't see the DMV revenue increase by 20%. There's a significant thing out there leaking and whatnot, and inspections might be one of them. Registration renewals might be another, but that's a little bit off of what we necessarily have to talk about today. I don't know if the DMV wants to make a comment or not from there. They don't have to. I'm not sure if anybody else has any questions, but Representative Noyes, here's my biggest piece that I struggle with right now, based on this part. I certainly struggle with inspections. I struggle with the idea that I couldn't keep what I thought was a plenty viable used car going because I couldn't get the dashboard lights off of the car for the passenger airbag, and I couldn't get them off for the emissions piece, and I couldn't get it off for an emergency brake that was working fine, but the light wouldn't go off no matter who looked at it. And so eventually, after all of one, have nothing to do with going forward or stopping or having all working lights. I find that very frustrating. I am not a fan of making people buy new vehicles when keeping a used car going forever is far more viable to my economic situation. But I just came from a conference committee and from significant testimony that we've taken that we are building a mileage-based user fee for electric vehicles, and we have intent language in our T-bill, at least submitted by the Senate and agreed to by many members in this committee, maybe not by all, but certainly many, that says we're going to move to a mileage-based user fee for all vehicles. And inspections are the place that the confirmation of the odometer is going to happen. So if we go to 2 years on inspections for verification of mileage, and people that are building and putting intent language saying we're going to this, we're going to rely on requiring the vehicles to come in and get inspected, I don't see how the committee can say that we are moving everyone to mileage-based user fee and potentially using our inspection facilities and the recording of that odometer that happens every year to make sure to coordinate with the billing and collections of your mileage-based user fee, and then to go and act on an amendment that's going to have the visit in every 2 years. The intent that's in the Senate proposal, the T-bill, and not in our portion, but is certainly being negotiated, is from what I understanding, and my limited capacity to understand, those seem directly in conflict to each other. So when it comes to your amendment, that's my biggest concern. We could probably figure out all of these other pieces, but
yeah. So my amendment doesn't obviously talk about the mileage-based fee, but that's not to say that an individual has a car, an electric car, or in the future, would periodically be required to pay their road tax. They can either stop in and get that mileage read and then submit their tax to the state. Could do it quarterly. They could do it every other year. They could do it every half year. You're still going to have to do it if you're going to want to register your car. And we have every 2 years on our registration. So, it's not that the vehicle needs to be inspected. It's that the individual needs to pay their tax on their road tax. So depending on what your financial situation is, you might say, look, I'm going to have to go quarterly to stop in and, make a payment you're just scanning that thing and looking at the mileage. So it's not like, that needs to be a whole inspection happening at that point. That could happen every other year.
that would incur a fee upon that vendor for being open and having that equipment and having a person available and paying that person available. So you've got to pay for that in some way. We do, or the car. I don't have the answer to that. I'm saying that is an expense to be open. It's an expense to have someone to have that equipment, to have it calibrated, to make sure that it's reporting that, to do. I'm saying that I'm saying I don't know the answer to those questions. I'm saying that we have two programs that are running essentially
Yep. I mean, I think there is different ideas we could come up with, whether it's on your income tax, you write down your mileage, and then true it up when you get your biannual vehicle inspection, and pay or whatever it is. I think they're almost two different things because you're being required to pay that gas tax.
And I think that the committee needs to recognize that we are going to be facing we've got quite the
Mhm.
challenge there, because what we're building for an infrastructure to do one is potentially in direct conflict of what we're talking about here.
Yeah,
And we
no doubt.
probably have to decide how we put it off, or how we add more conflict to this issue, or adopt the idea that we're gonna have to find another way potentially. So
Yeah.
these are the things, I don't know the answer.
And I don't
I'm just trying
even
to let you know
Sure.
what I'm hearing and what
Yeah.
we're
and
currently in the direction of doing.
right. And I wonder how many cars on the road don't have the plug-in for that are just going to have to go off their odometer. I got a
Don't they
1996.
take a picture of the odometer now at the
Yeah. I
inspection?
think that's what the plan was, they were taking a picture, and I think the system can read it, nobody's, but.
Yeah, the plug-in reads it, I believe.
For electric though, right?
No, for all cars. Yeah,
I'm dead set against
Inspection.
I would sit here up and down, and sit there and just think we're gonna do a mileage based user fee on vehicles. I'll be a big pain in the butt. I don't wanna hear that.
He said he's not in favor of money.
I'm not in favor of it at all. I'd rather see the gas tax go up a couple cents and sit there and. I'd rather see that. I will scream up and down. I don't like the idea the Senate will come tell us. I don't know, I'm dead set against that.
I appreciate that. And I probably break my own rule by giving community discussion, I guess, but as far as directed source there, that's all right. I am trying to be as clear as I can that it's a conflict. And there's no have to figure out what we can or can't do it. If there's more questions about the affordability, the idea of inspections being every other year, whether we want to hear additional testimony from the impact from the DMV, whether we want to hear from the A&R on it.
there you go.
I'm just saying that I'm bringing back
Yeah,
just came from a meeting that very clearly said
yeah,
that the absolute intent of the incentive is to go for all vehicles to go to mileage-based user fee, and we'd have to find another way if that's the intent.
Well, it doesn't matter, because the electric ones, the process was gonna be at inspections, and the plan was every year, so there's a conflict there. There may be a way around it, so. I like the concept of trying to save people money, and I'm not convinced that inspections, while I think there's a need for them, I'm not convinced it's worth the money.
Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Does anybody else want to? There are lots of phone of friends in the room. That doesn't mean that they have to comment, so, but otherwise we're representing well.
Did you give us a number of what do you think these consumers are going to save by getting a inspection every 2 years instead of one?
I guess it would depend on taking a day off of work if you have vacation time, or being able to have two cars in the family to be able to drop one off and then use the other one to get the family around. More so in rural Vermont where we don't have fixed route transportation versus in Chittenden County. So I don't have a cost, but it costs money to get your car inspected, no doubt about it.
Does.
Representative Noy, I really appreciate what you're
Thank you.
putting in. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you.
Informed of what we do or don't do in regards to your
Perfect.
proposal to amend S-123.
Thanks. Are you gonna continue to have discussion on this or
We're
gonna move on to a different topic?
right now, we're gonna be going on to another, let's see where we are on the time frame here. We got a few minutes, but our next witness is in the room, if anybody, we could I could be pushed as easily as that. And say whether I could, instead of, I think we already heard some of the discussion, instead of the question for the witnesses, open it up that way. I'm not sure that I want to do that. If our if our JFO witness is ready to go, we'll start a little bit early on the next subject. We're still in S-123. This is a little bit anticipatory because we haven't, we do have sections 15 and 16 related to renewals. We haven't closed out 15 and 16 in our S-123, where there is a potential for early renewals versus right now, it's only 6 months before your expiration date that you can renew. And we're looking at adding early renewals and for 2-year and 4-year options. There is some discussion and quite a bit of it, and it seems to be a bit fluid. So we are hearing about potential in the bill on the wall, H-351. There was a discussion about an 8-year option for Vermonters, and it's been the subject of a bunch of conversations. So I thought we would just bring in the JFO and ask that they explain or at least hit on what happened when we went from 2-year to 4-year, and what happens if we do go to an 8-year renewal option. So.
Well, good morning, everyone. Chris Ripp from Joint Fiscal. It feels like I've been here not very often this year, and I apologize that I have not really followed the committee's discussion on this item. I did follow and testified on this briefly in the other body when they were looking at the DMV bill, and what I'm going to share with you is essentially what I shared with them. I will preface this, and I appreciate the chair inviting me in to sort of clarify that, I've heard a lot of chatter around the building about whether or not JFO has a position on this. So I am very appreciative of the opportunity to once again say on the record that JFO does not take positions on matters of policy. Our job is to flag things that have a fiscal impact to the legislature, whether that is convenient for the policy discussion or not. So please don't shoot the messenger. I am here to give you a very high level understanding of sort of the revenue dynamics of shifting to an 8-year license and some of the considerations you all should have in mind. There's a handout on the website that I'm going to share. It's like annoyingly hard to read if you print it on hard copy, but if you blow it up on your screens, like it'll make sense. But I'm going to preface what I'm about to say with, there's a lot of numbers on here that you really shouldn't believe much of any of it. This is that's not something you hear me say very often. It's not something you hear very often, but the reason why I'm saying it is this is a very complicated topic that is very data intensive. And this is not a criticism of DMV one bit, but licensure data in DMV's legacy systems is sort of notoriously difficult to parse and extract and takes a lot of time to analyze, none of which we've had the time to do. So some of the numbers I'm going to show you are based on some other analysis we did from a few years ago, and then just making some extrapolations to show you sort of like the big picture. But like this thing has way more caveats in it than I'm ever used to giving, because I just want to underscore to everybody, like, don't read too much into these numbers. I'm trying to paint a picture for you. So like work with me, will you? So some of the considerations that you should have in mind is just, and some of this is based on my limited understanding of whatever has been proposed has been what has been included in the bills that have been introduced in the two bodies. And those bills require everybody to move over to an 8-year operator license, not make it an option. So right now we offer 2-year licenses and 4-year licenses. About 70% of the people do the 4-year, generally speaking. For the sake of argument, based on some of the numbers we used for the fee analysis we did a few years ago, just assume that on average about 44,000 people, licenses a year for the 2-year are issued, and 105,000 or so 4-year licenses are issued every year. Like there's fluctuation every year. People go from the 2-year to the 4-year, vice versa. Not the population's not static. You have some people moving in and out of the state. Like I know that these assumptions are wrong, but for the sake of like having a discussion today, let's just assume status quo and that everything's level. So the real high level is if you shift everybody to an 8-year license, you will increase revenue in the first 4 years of the 8 years, and then revenue is going to precipitously drop off for the back 4 years. You're essentially front loading the cash flow that you would get into the first 4 years. If all else is equal, the aggregate revenue by eliminating a 2-year would decrease slightly because the 2-year registration is a little bit more expensive on an annual basis. But you should also factor in any expense savings that DMV might have by not having to issue as many cards, particularly on like the materials and the supplies. I don't imagine you would have a ton of labor savings unless you can drastically readjust the workforce, but you would have fewer cards going out. Back to the earlier discussion, DMV does not keep all of this revenue, whether we're talking about the $8 inspection sticker, which generates around $4 million a year, or this, it all goes into the T fund. Money gets appropriated out of the T fund to support DMV and the rest of the transportation program. So it's not like it's their money. It goes into the pot that then gets appropriated. So this chart here is really an exercise in following shades of color and pictures. And this is meant to just be able to track different cohorts of license renewals, not individuals, but just cohorts of people. So at this very, very top, this blue one here, I tried to do blue for the 2-year crowd and green for the 4-year crowd. I would read this as this first box in 21. You see that same shade reappear in 23 because that's when their 2 years is up. See it again in 25. Then for the sake of discussion, assume that beginning in 26, anybody goes to an 8-year. That person, those cohorts would then renew in 27. And then there wouldn't be more money coming in through the 8-year until 2035. So read that way as you go across. And then you also see that with the 4-year license renewals, there's a little bit more of a tail because there's a 4-year period. You should not read the blank spots between fiscal years 28 and 33 as anybody implying that nobody's going to issue any licenses that year. We know that like licenses are going to get issued. Like this is just to sort of illustrate, if you're a visual learner like I am, trying to get your head around if all else is equal, who's going to be renewing in what cycles if they keep sticking with the same license patterns that they have in the past. But the real takeaway here is that you've got that gap in the out 4 years where you're not going to be bringing in very much revenue. One option that folks might want to look at, because different states have done, a little less than half of the states offer an 8-year, but they do it differently. Some states, everybody has to be on an 8-year. Some states it's an option. The fiscal risk of making it an option is lessened than if it is a requirement, because there's always going to be some population that is going to stick with what they've been doing. Like I would imagine there's a whole lot of people in the 2-year license category that probably aren't going to find going to an 8-year as a very attractive option because for whatever reason they chose to do the 2-year. Maybe they're a college student. Maybe, the cost is an issue. You might be a little more likely to see people go from the 4-year to the 8-year. I don't know how likely it would be to see people go from the 8-year to back to the 2-year. These are all questions that I think require a lot of time to really understand and look at what the experience was in other states. I know in some states they've done sort of a phased approach where like different people could transition to a longer license at different periods to try to smooth out some of these revenue fluctuations. But there's different models out there. It takes time to understand what lessons are out there that we could learn from. Something that I think you should keep in mind is, again, I'm going back to the visual thing. I look at when I see this, I think of like taking a big rock and throwing it into like a puddle or a pool where you create these big waves. And then over time, like the waves get smaller and smaller. Generally speaking, whenever we've transitioned from things like, allowing a 1-year or a 2-year or a 2-year or a 4-year, you see these waves at first. And then over time, things start to normalize a little bit more from year to year. It doesn't go away completely. It doesn't go away automatically. But just think about, or instantly, but just think about attrition in the population of who's coming into DMV, who's exiting DMV. People are moving between the 2 and the 4. This data is not linear. You should expect it to fluctuate. I don't even want to get into our crazy back of the envelope methodology for trying to estimate DMV fee increases, but it's a lot of, let's make some assumptions and round down because the data is just not that perfect. So there are, I think, some outstanding policy questions you should think about. And you should also be mindful that other states that have gone to this might have had a greater appetite for fiscal risk than you might consider Vermont to have right now. Some states have much higher rates of growth, population growth than we do. We have very little organic growth in our transportation revenue base in particular. Our working age population is shrinking. We are very demographically challenged. I think that's a very different story here than you might see in like Sunbelt states where they can bank on some estimated long-term population growth. That's very difficult for us to bake into our fiscal assumptions. I think if we were to have a really, really solid estimate on what this would mean, it would require a very extensive data pool from DMV and a lot of time to really parse the numbers and to start looking at what other states have done. Do they see different behavioral shifts that we should consider in our models, so on and so forth. I wanted to just leave you with a few outstanding questions, like if the legislature does have appetite to continue looking at this topic in general, you should think about whether such a transition should be optional or mandatory for everyone, whether it should just apply to operators' licenses or other forms of ID, whether or not it makes sense to exclude certain populations from an 8-year license renewal. Take a look at what those experiences in other states have been and check in with DMV and see if they have any operational concerns or time constraints related to implementation, because oftentimes something may seem like a really simple shift, but when you really start looking under the hood about what's required from a programming perspective, redesigning forms, do regulations need to be updated? Like all of the aspects of actually implementing on the ground the legislature's will, I think you'll want to ask DMV to understand if there's any complications out there. So that's my spiel today. Again, I'm going to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that JFO does not take positions on matters of policy. We don't have a vote around here. We don't want to vote around here. That's for you all. Our job is to highlight the fiscal considerations you all should keep in mind as you think about proposals and answer any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you, Representative Wells, and then Representative Powers. Representative Lowry.
So it sounds like one of the major options is that steady, consistent revenue coming in. But if we go to 8 years, you're going to get your money anyway, I take it, the same amount of money that we spread over. Or is there a difference if you get a 2-year? Is that the highest rate? 4 years, a little better deal?
Yeah.
8 years, a little better deal?
Yeah, on the numbers that I have on my chart came from the legislation that was introduced. And my understanding is the 8-year, that 124 is based on prorating the fee for the 4-year. The 4 and the 8-year, you're bringing in $15.50 a year on average. The 2-year is a little more expensive or more lucrative, depending on your perspective, $19.50 a year. But again, I think you need to factor in also, is there a cost savings to DMV by not having to send out quite so many ID cards? So at the end of the day, it probably sugars off to some extent. I think the bigger concern is the timing of the cash flow. So if you get a lot of the money in the initial years and then you see a dip, this is not an insignificant fee. These are millions of dollars from these line items every year. So the legislature should consider how you're going to deal with the fact that you're front loading that money in the early part of that 8-year period until things, many, many years in the future start to normalize a little bit.
Do other states get them a discount for the extended years? And what's to stop us from saying whether you get a 2, a 4, or an 8, you pay the same rate?
That is all policy decisions.
Okay.
And I think
Fair enough.
they vary by the legislature,
Okay.
by the state.
Representative Powers, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. We discussed this very briefly just in the hallway. Could we, when we take these fees in, so if somebody's got 4-year renewal, we divvy it out back to so it goes into an account and then it gets divvied out over time. So we don't get these fluctuations so much that it's, spread out. So if I did 8 years, that, maybe it's every 2 years, a chunk of that money goes in. So a year from now or 2 years from now, the T fund has put aside the future use of these funds. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are potential avenues to do something like that where you could, I'm thinking out loud, I'm not proposing
Yeah.
anything, but if you were to pay, $124, maybe 50% of it would get credited to the current year T fund and 50% might go to some reserve account for the future. I think the challenge is there's a lot of other questions that need to be answered before that can be modeled. So like, is this a mandatory shift for everybody at the same time? Is this optional overtime? We would need the data, I think, to really model the cash flow then based on like what those decisions are, because those decisions will have a very significant impact. If you were to make it mandatory for everybody at like a certain point, you would get more money in the first 2 years from your 2-year folks going through their renewal cycle, then it would drop down a little bit for those subsequent year 3 and year 4. So how you sort of adjust that so you're not creating other ripples in the future. The ripples would be smaller, but I think it all comes down to the fact that we would need some decisions made and some time and some data in order to do some real modeling.
Representative Riley, you're up, and then Representative McCoy. I thought you had your hand up
No.
earlier. You didn't. Representative McCoy, you're up.
So I know you're not a policy issue person, but in your chart at the bottom, you have should certain populations be exempted? So in your research on this, have you, like, what would be certain populations that would be?
Great question. I've done very little research on this because I haven't had a lot of time, and JFO has not really been engaged very much in this topic this session. But the one population that came to mind is, if you're in the later actuarially projected stages of your driving history, perhaps there might be some consideration made as to whether it makes sense to have an 8-year renewal.
Well, I guess I would also comment that we've already, certain populations we have in this bill, people entering foster care. We had in this bill SSI and SSDI. We've had in the bill multiple different areas of population. So there are other pieces that do or don't apply. Who manages reserves accounts in the state government?
Finance and management.
And setting up a reserve account comes through what I assume, how does that?
Yeah, the legislature typically enacts them, and I'm using the word reserve account loosely to try to describe in plain English sort of the intent. I think, in accounting terms, it would probably be a special fund.
So, are you familiar with the bill where the Senate went out and found a fund that had money in it and decided to pull money out and create a new program?
I'm quite familiar with it.
Are you familiar with the revisions or revisions, was it, or reversions? Reversions that happen in the town highway fund ourselves when money within the T fund hadn't been spent. A project perhaps hadn't been as quickly done as it otherwise would, that we then reverted that money to a more immediate expense. I guess when I love the idea that we would have an increase of immediate money in the T funds, but then I say, okay, those two concerns, but even before that, would our workforce be able to expand? Could we actually, one of the things we talk about when we brainstorm the idea of bonding and we get an influx of money, what would the workforce and the construction ability of the limited capacity that's in Vermont and a limited construction season, how quickly would we respond and make that work happen? The idea if we get too far behind in construction, and then we decide that now we're going to fund the T fund money way up, so that we can catch up. With our limited construction season, our limited workforce, and our limited ability to respond, how the heck would we be able to get caught up with that amount of money? In the meantime, we have a fund that's sitting there, and I've already seen twice, each of the last 2 years, wherever there's money sitting in government, holy smokes, they all of a sudden go after it and take it out and use it. How do I protect my T fund money from a future legislature to using it somewhere else?
I think, Mr. Chair, you are hitting on a very important concept that you often hear Leg Council and JFO say, that you cannot bind the hands of a future legislature. So there is nothing to stop a future legislature from notwithstanding a statute or transferring money from one fund to another. You all write the laws, you all can modify the laws.
So payments in lieu of taxes generally goes to municipalities and towns who have state property in them.
Hmm.
Right, and they take that now, and that money's supposed to go to pay that, help the town put the services because that property doesn't pay taxes, right?
Yeah.
So in the RT bill that we're conferring on right now, magically money that was destined to towns, paid for in lieu of by towns who had property that had provided services, and that fund has now been pulled to 1.1 million, used for something that doesn't benefit a town directly at all, maybe perhaps some citizens of their town, but doesn't benefit their town.
I think your point is well taken, and
Is that a possibility with other funds? And is that, yeah, go ahead.
Of course it's
I'm sorry. I
yeah,
interrupted.
of course it's a possibility, and I think the what you're getting at is, and I'm going to bring this right back to the example you cited, was the pilot special fund has a surplus, a year-end surplus from FY24 and a structural surplus moving forward because the revenues into it exceed the cost of the payments in lieu of taxes that the state owes to municipalities. There is a pot of money there that has money sitting in it, and the legislature does what the legislature does with it.
Yes, we need a lockbox.
Oh. I guess my examples of the previous year is the same thing, isn't it? And in fact, all within our own department, money that was geared towards town highways that our vice chair was livid about. We took that money and spent it on other things last year in the T-bill.
Yeah, I think that was there's a bit of a cash flow nuance there too, where I don't think it came out of the hide of a town per se, but rather than carry forward an appropriation for many, many years into the future until it's paid out, the legislature did revert some of that money to use on current year priorities. So
Not necessarily a town project, like any project.
right, so
It was earmarked originally for a town and it ended up potentially not on a town project.
the legislature generally can move money around. And my nonpartisan fiscal advisor to the branch advice is always be very careful with how much you restrict funds. Because the number one tool the legislature has in setting priorities is the appropriations process. And every time you say, this money goes here, that money goes there, this is ours, this is yours, don't touch it, you are limiting the legislature's ability to effectively set priorities and respond to evolving fiscal considerations. So regardless of the issue, I always try to remind legislators to just be mindful that fiscal flexibility can be a good thing. It's how you use it that really counts.
Representative Tomlinson, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this information. Very helpful. And just looking at the numbers that you have below the chart, 8.6 million.
Don't believe any of those numbers.
Well, so I guess what I'm trying to understand, then if you could give me some sense of numbers, I can believe. You mentioned the fluctuation that occurred after the 2 to 4 year renewal option addition. Could you give a sense of the scale of that fluctuation? Is that in the hundreds
So
of
we
thousands of dollars?
need more
or-
data from DMV. That's the issue.
We
It's
don't have
like-
the historical data on revenue from.
I don't have the unit data historical for every year. So we need to have data pools from DMV, and we requested some data yesterday. We didn't get, I don't think, everything we needed. But that's not something we can turn around in 24 hours. DMV data, especially since they just switched systems, the systems, when you go back, don't like talk to each other. So you have to do a lot of manual extraction and cobbling it together. When the legislature did the DMV fee increases 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that took about a month to get the data. So generally speaking, these trends would be what you would expect, but pending more precise license issuance data, especially from 23, 24, and 25, I can't give you a firm estimate. The numbers that we put on that row are just to give you some magnitude of like, if you took these hypothetical units and multiplied it by some hypothetical fee, this is what the change would look like in relative size.
Okay, thanks. And yeah, look forward to some more information and numbers on that. And also, just to make sure I understand correctly, adding an option as opposed to requiring or having solely an 8-year option would have a more limited impact on that fluctuation.
No,
Is that-
It will.
And if an 8-year option were to be proportional to the 4-year option, the prorated numbers, you kind of outlined an assumption that it's more likely that folks who have a 4-year license would opt for that 8-year rather than jumping from a 2-year to an 8-year, because they likely have reasons they've maintained a 2-year. So would that have roughly neutral impacts on the overall revenue? It might fluctuate what's coming in year to year, but overall that revenue coming in would be roughly.
Generally speaking, if all else is equal, the net revenue across a period of time would be equal. But the timing of the cash flow is a significant fiscal consideration. And something else is to be mindful of is if the legislature were to adjust fees, it will yield less money in the near term if most people are already locked into an 8-year license, because they're going to go much longer until they pay the higher fee. So that's
If they were required or most people had opted.
I just think if you're in the 8-year in general, you're insuring in a way against future legislative fee increases. You're kind of locking it in for an 8-year period.
Wouldn't have been hit by I'm sorry, I got you. I didn't think of that. That's interesting.
But all of those are very good questions that I go back to. There's a lot of data analysis that would need to have happen in order for us to put an estimate together on what this would likely translate to in terms of the impacts of the T fund. And we would have to make some assumptions about if it were an option, what kind of behavior change would there be? And there might be lessons learned from other states, or we can just wing it and see how it goes. But but it is a complicated question.
Thanks.
We are, did you?
Just nothing's easy.
Certainly feeling that way this week and last more than some.
I feel your pain.
We are adjourned for one more announcement. The next meeting of the committee conference for the T-bill is at 3:30, anticipated only to be 20 minutes to 30 minutes, and then we'll pick up again tomorrow. But the conference committee will meet at 3:30.